On one side of a police station corridor, a young man is still breathing. On the other, a system has already decided he won't be allowed to finish the week. The terrifying part is not the violence. It's the paperwork, forms, signatures. A neat little file that says a human being can be erased with administrative calm. And somewhere behind that file sits a name that still makes power nervous. Steve Biko. Before the headlines, before the martyr photographs, before the whispered slogan, there was a boy in the Eastern Cape, born on December 18th, 1946, in Ginsburg Township near King Williamstown, a place of dust and tight streets, where your future was often measured in what you were not allowed to become. The apartheid state had a talent for making limits feel natural, like gravity. It built a world where separate was advertised as order, where signs told you which door to use, which bench to sit on, which education you deserved. The trick wasn't just to control bodies, it was to shrink imagination. Steve's family didn't have the luxury of pretending politics was something far away. His father, Mzingaya Biko, worked as a government clerk and died when Steve was still a child. Loss arrived early and stayed close. His mother, Alice Biko, took jobs as a domestic worker and a cook, work that demanded long hours and swallowed dignity one day at a time. If you want a visual that explains apartheid in miniature, picture a mother leaving before sunrise to clean someone else's house, then returning to a township that the state had designed to remind her she would never belong to the real city. Steve grew up watching that contradiction. Black labor building white comfort, while black lives were treated as disposable. He was bright, dangerously bright, in a country where intelligence in a black child could be treated like insolence. At school, Steve was sharp with language, quick with arguments, and already allergic to humiliation. He learned early that there are two kinds of silence, the kind forced on you and the kind you choose because you're planning. He didn't speak like someone begging to be accepted. He spoke like someone noticing the rules were absurd. The first time the system truly reached into his life with both hands was through his older brother, Kaya Biko. Kaya became involved in anti-apartheid activity and was arrested. The police didn't just take a person. They took the air out of a household. Suddenly, your home became a place where footsteps outside could freeze your blood. You learned to listen for engines. You learned how quickly a normal day could become an interrogation. Steve was still a teenager when the state gave him a lesson. It could punish you for what you did, and it could punish you for what it suspected you might one day do. Steve attended Lovedale, a famous mission school that had educated many black South African leaders. Lovedale carried a reputation, discipline, prestige, the promise that education could be a ladder. But under apartheid, ladders were often set up beneath ceilings, and Steve, restless, questioning, didn't fit neatly into obedience. After his brother's arrest, Steve himself was targeted. He was accused of being connected to political activity, questioned, harassed, and ultimately expelled. The official reasons were always tidy. The real reason was messier. He was becoming the kind of young man the system couldn't easily shape. Expulsion is a strange punishment. It tries to turn you into a warning for others. But sometimes it does the opposite. It concentrates you. It forces a person to decide whether they will shrink or grow teeth. Steve transferred to St. Francis College, a Catholic boarding school at Marianne Hill in Natal. There, surrounded by new faces and stricter routines, he did something that would define him. He turned isolation into clarity. He read, he observed, he argued. He watched how even well-meaning institutions could reproduce the same psychological cage, polite, smiling, civilized, while still accepting the core lie that black people were less. This is where the clock begins to tick in a way Steve can't yet see. Not a literal countdown on a wall, but a hidden timer built into every step he takes toward leadership. Because in South Africa at that time, if you became too effective, you didn't get to grow old. You got a file. You got watched. You got handled. Steve doesn't know his deadline yet, but the audience should. He has less than 31 years to live, and most of what will make him immortal will happen in just the last few. He graduates from St. Francis and chooses medicine, an almost audacious choice. Medicine meant stepping into a world of white coats and white authority, into institutions where black patients were abundant, but black doctors were still treated like anomalies. In 1966, he enters the University of Natal Medical School in Durban, one of the few places a black student could study medicine, though even that permission came with segregation and constant reminders of inferiority. Imagine training to save lives while being told, in thousands of small ways, that your own life is worth less. Durban in the late 1960s is not just a city. It's a pressure cooker. Apartheid is law, but resistance is everywhere. Sometimes loud, sometimes hidden in plain sight. The African National Congress and Pan-Africanist Congress have been banned. Many leaders are imprisoned, exiled, silenced. The state wants the world to believe it has solved dissent, but young people keep appearing like sparks in dry grass. At university, Steve meets a new kind of battlefield: student politics. On paper, student organizations look like debates and committees. In reality, they are rehearsal rooms for revolution, places where language becomes weaponry and confidence becomes contagious. Steve joins the National Union of South African Students, known as NUSAS. It is officially multiracial and openly opposed to apartheid. For many, it is the bravest available platform. For Steve, it becomes a lesson in the limits of white liberalism. Here is one of the sharp contradictions that will shape his entire philosophy. White students in NUSAS can denounce apartheid in a meeting, then go home to neighborhoods protected by apartheid. They can risk something, yes, but the floor beneath them is still built to catch their fall. Black students do not have that floor. When black students speak, it is not theory, it is exposure. Steve begins to notice how even sympathetic white liberals can unconsciously dominate space, setting agendas, chairing meetings, defining what reasonable resistance looks like. It's subtle, it's dressed in good manners, but it's power all the same. And Steve has an instinct for power dynamics, the way some people have perfect pitch. He hears the false notes immediately. A pivotal moment arrives in 1967 during a NUSAS conference planned at Rhodes University. Black delegates are expected to attend, but they are not allowed to stay in the same accommodations as white delegates because of segregation laws. The absurdity is cinematic. A supposedly anti-apartheid gathering forced to obey apartheid logistics. Some white members treat it as an inconvenience. Steve reads it as a revelation. How can you fight oppression while allowing its rules to shape your movement? How can black students build self-respect while being physically separated for the sake of compliance? This isn't just anger, it's strategy. Steve starts to articulate something that will become a blade. Psychological liberation must come before political liberation. If you accept the oppressor's definitions of you, if you internalize inferiority, then even freedom, when it arrives, will be fragile. He watches black students waiting to be included and realizes inclusion can be a trap when it requires you to shrink yourself to fit. A movement that depends on permission will always be one signature away from paralysis. And now, the rival appears more clearly. Not a single villain with a mustache, but a competitor in the struggle itself. On one side, the established current, white-led liberal student activism, confident that integration under their guidance is the path forward. On the other side, the emerging force Steve begins to represent. Black-led organization, built on self-definition, refusing to be an appendix to someone else's conscience. This rivalry is explosive because both sides claim morality. Both claim justice, but they are fighting over the steering wheel. Steve's personality adds fuel. He is charismatic, but not in a soft way. He has the kind of charm that doesn't ask for permission. He can be playful, even witty, and then suddenly cut to a sentence that lands like a punch. People around him start to feel something dangerous. Possibility. And possibility is exactly what apartheid tries to suffocate. In 1968, conversations among black students intensify. Steve is not alone. Others are asking the same question in different words. Why are black voices always filtered through white structures, even in opposition? The answer forms into a decision. In 1969, the South African Students' Organization is launched, SASO, a black student organization led by black students for black students. The word black here is political, not simply biological. It is meant to include Africans, Indians, and colored people, those classified and divided by the apartheid state, now invited into a shared identity of resistance. This is a thunderclap, not because it introduces anger has always been there, but because it turns anger into an organized philosophy. SASO is a declaration that black people do not need white approval to resist. That dignity is not negotiable. That leadership is not borrowed. The twist is that Steve's fiercest competitor is not only the apartheid government, it is also the comforting idea, shared by many well-meaning allies, that black liberation must be guided, moderated, supervised. Steve is challenging that, and challenges like that create enemies in surprising places. Some will accuse him of reverse racism, some will call him divisive. He understands something most people avoid. When you stop begging for a seat at the table and start building your own table, even friends can panic. By 1969, Steve is rising fast. In SASO, his influence is unmistakable. He becomes its first president and a chief voice of what will soon be called the Black Consciousness Movement. His speeches circulate. His phrases stick in people's heads like hooks. He talks about self-reliance, pride, mental freedom. He insists that the most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, a line that will outlive him. But while Steve is building a new language, the state is taking notes. In South Africa, attention from the government is never neutral. The security branch watches organizers the way hunters watch tracks. Names go into files. Friends are questioned. Phones click in strange ways. The pressure is not always visible, but it's felt, like a storm, changing the air. Steve is still a medical student at this point, still officially on the path to becoming a doctor. That double life, future healer, present agitator, creates an internal tension that makes him even more compelling. Because every day he studies anatomy, the state is practicing a different kind of anatomy, mapping the bones of dissent, deciding where to strike to break it. And now the time constraint tightens, even if Steve doesn't know the exact date. Each meeting, each speech, each new recruit is another step toward a line he won't be allowed to cross peacefully. The rivalries are multiplying between black-led self-definition and white-led liberal frameworks, between students who want gradual change and those who feel the emergency in their lungs, between a young leader who refuses to be managed and a government that cannot tolerate an unmanageable black mind. By the end of this stretch, childhood sharpened by loss, adolescence scarred by surveillance, university years turning frustration into doctrine, Steve Biko is no longer just a student with opinions. He is becoming the kind of figure who changes what people think is possible. And in apartheid South Africa, changing what people believe about themselves is more dangerous than any weapon. Because once a person stops feeling inferior, an entire empire starts to look ridiculous. And when an empire starts to look ridiculous, it starts to feel mortal. That is the moment the state notices him, not as a student, but as a threat to the national mood. Somewhere in a security branch office, his photograph is moved from one file to another. Not just student agitator, potential architect of a different future, his speeches at SASO gatherings don't sound like resolutions. They sound like alarms. He tells black students to stop asking to be accommodated and start asking what they owe to themselves, to stop measuring progress by how comfortable white liberals feel sitting next to them. In crowded university halls and dusty township classrooms, the same sentence lands with a jolt. Black man, you are on your own. To the government, it sounds like defiance. To a generation, it sounds like permission to breathe. Success, for Steve, doesn't look like a title on an office door. It looks like a shift in posture. He watches students who used to speak softly now look administrators in the eye. He hears jokes change, from self-mockery to sharp satire, aimed at the absurdity of apartheid. SASO's newsletters, stamped and folded, begin to travel far beyond campuses, passed hand-to-hand in trains and township streets. The black consciousness philosophy is spreading like an underground frequency. Once you tune into it, regular propaganda sounds flat, ridiculous, even childish. But the more the idea spreads, the more another kind of rivalry sharpens. On one side, Steve's insistence that black people must define themselves, stand alone, trust their own leadership. On the other, a familiar script. White liberal organizations insisting that fragmentation is dangerous, that unity under their umbrella is the only responsible path. They are not wearing uniforms or carrying guns, but they are competing for the same precious territory, black political imagination. The clash isn't dramatic in the way movies like to show it. No shouted confrontations in Parliament, no televised debates. Instead, it's coded minutes from meetings, tense conversations in university cafeterias, invitations never sent, platforms never offered. Steve is accused of being exclusionary, of pushing away allies. He listens, and then he answers with something sharper. The problem is not that white liberals are in our way. The problem is that we have allowed them to define the direction of the road. That line travels like contraband. Young activists repeat it in whispers, then in open meetings. Some white student leaders feel betrayed. They thought they were on the same side. In a way, they are. But Steve understands that in liberation politics, side and steering wheel are not the same thing. He is not willing to trade dignity for sponsorship. While these tensions brew, Steve's personal life seems, from the outside, almost conventional. In 1970, he marries Nsiki Mashalaba. There are photographs where he doesn't look like a symbol, just a young man in love, smiling, holding a child. They have a son, and later more children. And for brief stretches, he tastes what a quieter life could be. Laughter in small kitchens, late-night conversations about ordinary worries, not just revolution, but even in these intimate spaces, politics leaks in like a draft. Friends who visit carry stories of detentions and raids. Newspapers bring news of new apartheid laws, new restrictions, new arrests. The home that should be a refuge becomes a kind of listening post. Every knock on the door carries two possibilities: a neighbor or the police. Medicine, once his chosen profession, begins to feel less like a calling and more like a corridor he is being pushed down. At the University of Natal, he keeps failing not in intellect, but in patience. Exams become harder to care about when compared to the daily emergency outside campus. Families evicted, workers shot at, activists jailed. In lectures on pathology, he memorizes how disease eats at organs. Outside, he studies a different pathology, the slow sickness of a society that has normalized humiliation. By 1972, the strain breaks the illusion that he can be half one thing, half another. He abandons formal medical studies. To some, it looks like a waste, a fall from a respectable future. To him, it is a brutal calculation. He can spend the next decade learning to treat individual bodies or spend the next few years, because he senses he might not have many, trying to heal a damaged collective mind. That decision is a twist the system did not quite predict. A black doctor can be contained, a regulated professional, a success story the government can point to as proof that opportunities exist. A free-roaming political thinker is harder to manage. Steve steps fully into movement work, joining the Black community programs, a network of projects designed to turn Black consciousness into practical action. The idea is simple and explosive. Empowerment not as a speech, but as a clinic, a creche, a literacy class, a legal advice center. In Durban and then other towns, BCP offices open in modest buildings with peeling paint and second-hand furniture. They offer what the state withholds, basic services, but they also offer something the state cannot tolerate: spaces where Black people organize without white supervision, where they talk about themselves using words that do not ask for pity. Here, the rivalry with the government's preferred Black leaders becomes deadly serious. The apartheid regime is not stupid. It understands the value of a friendly face. It builds the Bantustan system, elevating chiefs and politicians who speak the language of separate development, who tell their people that accepting homelands and limited rights is pragmatism, not surrender. These men are given cars, offices, flags, and a script: patience, order, gradual progress under white control. Steve's message is the opposite. He tells people that accepting crumbs is not pragmatism, it is participation in your own diminishment, that no amount of local self-rule is real if the basic premise of white superiority remains untouched. In remote halls and packed church basements, he speaks with a calm that feels more dangerous than shouting. They will give you a flag, he says, and expect you to forget the chains. In the eyes of the state-approved Black elite, he is not just a critic, he is a competitor for the soul of their people. By now, his name is a rumor, even in places he has never visited. Steve Biko. Some pronounce it carefully, others whisper it like a password. The security branch tracks this spread with growing concern. Reports land on desks in Pretoria describing subversive influence, racial polarization, Black exclusivism. The words are dry, but the implication is clear. This is not just another protester to be arrested and released. This is a mind rewiring how people understand themselves. The state realizes it is in a race against something abstract but powerful. If Black consciousness takes firm root, the old tools pass. Laws, job reservations, informers might not be enough. You can control movement with police. Controlling self-respect is harder. The countdown becomes explicit. In early 1973, the Minister of Justice signs a piece of paper that lands like a hammer on Steve's life: a banning order. The banning order is both precise and absurd, a brutal bureaucratic spell. It bans Steve from attending gatherings. It forbids him from being quoted. It confines him to the area of King William's Town. It restricts whom he can meet, where he can work, what he can read in public spaces. In a single document, the government tries to compress a continent of influence into a small radius, hoping he will suffocate. For 5 years, the order says, 5 years in which he is supposed to disappear from public life, become a ghost in his own country. Here is the cruel time limit. Officially, the state is giving itself half a decade to erase his impact. Unofficially, another clock is ticking, because Steve Biko will be dead in less than 4. They send him back, in a sense, to where he started, the Eastern Cape, King Williamstown, close to Ginsburg. What looks like exile is also an unintended twist. The government imagines it is burying him in a small town. Instead, it has just dropped the most dangerous ideas of a generation back into the soil that first shaped him. Under banning, He cannot legally address more than one person at a time, but conversations have never been his only weapon. He writes under pseudonyms, smuggles essays out through friends, turns his home into a quiet hub. People visit for tea and leave carrying strategies. In back rooms of churches and clinics, the Black community programs continue their work, now with Steve's guidance sharpened by the knowledge that every knock on the door could be the one that ends his freedom or his life. In this confined space, the rivalry with his competitors takes on a new psychological intensity. The government's Black allies point to his banning order as proof of his recklessness, whispering that his approach only brings suffering. Look, they say, what did his defiance achieve? Now he is silenced, and you are left with the consequences. White liberals, too, sometimes shake their heads. If only he had been more patient, less radical, more willing to compromise. The implication is always the same. The problem is not the brutality of apartheid, but the impatience of those who refuse to negotiate. With their own humiliation, Steve sees through this. From his restricted life, he crafts an answer that will echo long after. That moderation in the face of systematic degradation is not wisdom. It is surrender dressed up as sophistication. The physical pressure increases. Police cars become a regular feature outside his house. He is detained for questioning, released, detained again, his days chopped into unpredictable fragments. Friends are arrested, some tortured. Each time he is taken in, his family waits in a suspended present, unsure if he will return. The urgency that has always pulsed beneath his work now becomes personal in a new way. He is 26, 27, 28, ages when most people are planning careers, saving for houses, imagining long futures. He is planning how to compress as much influence as possible into what he increasingly suspects might be a very short life. It is not a dramatic movie scene realization. No violins, no close-ups, just a steady, growing awareness that the state is not going to let him age peacefully. And yet, under this pressure, he does something that continues to unsettle his opponents. He refuses to become bitter. His writing during these years is sharp, but not consumed by hatred. He mocks the absurdity of the regime, exposes the psychological wounds it inflicts, but he also imagines a future in which Black and white can coexist on one non-negotiable condition, that equality is real, not staged. He will not offer comfort to those who benefit from injustice, but he also will not poison his vision with the idea of permanent enemies. This unnerves both the government and some of his rivals. They want him to fit a simpler script, dangerous radical, consumed with rage. Instead, he insists on a more complicated role. Dangerous, yes, but because he is clear, because he is unafraid to imagine a South Africa in which whiteness is no longer a passport, but simply a fact. Outside his constrained world, the country is moving toward an explosion. Townships simmer with anger over forced removals, police shootings, inferior schools. A younger generation of students, even more impatient, is growing up on the language of Black consciousness that he helped shape. The government thinks it has isolated him, but his ideas have already slipped past the checkpoints. In 1976, in Soweto, school children will march against the imposition of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, and many of them will chant slogans forged in the furnace of Black consciousness. But that is still slightly ahead in the next act of this story. For now, Steve sits in a small town under a banning order, writing, meeting, planning, living inside a shrinking circle of allowed movement, while his influence expands far beyond any boundary line a bureaucrat can draw on a map. The race is now fully set. On one side, a regime with guns, prisons, laws, and the cold confidence that comes from centuries of unchallenged power. On the other, a banned man in his late 20s who does not control a single soldier or police van, but who has helped tens of thousands of people decide that their own humanity is non-negotiable. The state believes time is on its side. It has been here before many Steves, many movements. Steve believes that time is finally beginning to tilt, not because the regime is softening, but because the people who live under it are changing how they see themselves. Two clocks, two rival strategies, one small country stretching under a sky that feels too low. Somewhere in that tightening space, a confrontation is approaching that will turn Steve Biko from a name in state security files into a face the whole world will be forced to look at. Picture this: the most dangerous man in South Africa can't legally speak to more than one person at a time. And yet the government's most feared generals are still losing sleep over him. No bombs, no guns, just a banned man, a shrinking map, and an idea they can't seem to suffocate before the clock runs out. Day by day, Steve tries to turn restriction into strategy. King Williamstown is supposed to be his cage, but he treats it like a command center with bad furniture. He moves into a modest house in Ginsburg, the township where he grew up, and from the outside, nothing looks historic. Dusty streets, corrugated roofs, kids playing barefoot soccer. Inside, though, the air is thick with plans. The black community programs set up offices nearby, and he throws himself into work that makes ideology feel like something you can hold in your hands. Clinics, creche, skills workshops, legal advice centers. If the state's logic is, keep them poor, scared, and grateful, his reply is simple. Teach them to rely on each other, and the fear will have nowhere to live. One building becomes the perfect symbol of this quiet rebellion. The Zanampilo Community Health Center. It is not a gleaming hospital. It's a humble clinic with peeling paint and worn chairs. But in a country designed to let black people die quietly of natural causes, a place where black doctors and nurses treat black patients with respect is revolutionary. Women arrive with sick children and leave not just with medicine, but with a subtle shift in posture. They were not helped by a white charity. They were served by their own. Steve walks through the waiting room, greeting people by name, listening more than he speaks. If you saw him there, you might mistake him for just another local organizer. But every blood pressure check, every immunization, every conversation about diet and dignity is part of a larger campaign to prove that black self-reliance is not a slogan. It's a functioning alternative to apartheid. Far away, in Pretoria offices, with good carpets and colder hearts, men in suits read reports about these projects with increasing irritation. Clinics, literacy classes, agricultural co-ops. On paper, it looks almost harmless, even constructive. But the security branch, the sharp teeth of the regime, understands the real danger. These are parallel institutions, miniature prototypes of a South Africa that doesn't need white permission to breathe. They give this threat a name in their own files: subversive community development. And inside those grey folders, one name keeps recurring: Stephen Bantu Biko. If the state itself is one rival, then its favorite tactic is another: the creation of acceptable black leadership to compete with him. Homeland chiefs, Bantustan presidents, ministry-approved community spokesmen, men who drive government-issued cars and deliver government-written speeches about responsible progress. They visit the same townships, shake some of the same hands, promise development in exchange for obedience. On the surface, their message doesn't sound too different: peace, order, improvement. But listen closely, and you hear the crucial trade they're trying to sell: accept your place, and we will make your cage more comfortable. Steve's message undercuts that deal like acid. He tells people not to negotiate for softer chains, but to question why they're chained at all. To the men in dark suits, He isn't just a dissident. He's a direct competitor for the loyalty of millions. The rivalry grows more personal when one particular security branch officer starts appearing in the margins of Steve's life like a recurring shadow. Call him what he was in real history: a colonel in the Eastern Cape branch, a man whose name will one day be linked to torture chambers and inquests. In this story, he stands in for the whole machinery of repression, but he thinks of himself as something more specific: the man who will break Biko before the banning order expires. For him, it's a career-defining contest. For Steve, it's a lethal game he never volunteered for but refuses to lose in the only way that would really matter: by betraying what he stands for. Time, for both of them, becomes a weapon. The banning order says 5 years. That's supposed to be enough to turn a rising leader into a forgettable provincial case. Steve reads the date on that document like a countdown. Each clinic opened is a point on the board. Each essay smuggled out under a pseudonym is another move. He sends out ideas like messages in bottles, articles on black consciousness, analyses of apartheid psychology, letters that interrogate not just laws, but the way black people have learned to doubt themselves. If they can't quote him by name, that almost suits him. The words have to live or die on their own. And they live. They circulate in photocopies, in handwritten copies, in oral retellings, at nighttime meetings. Somewhere, he knows, his rival is watching the same spread, marked in red on maps, and wondering why the lines keep multiplying despite all the restrictions. The pressure of the contest doesn't just sit on Steve's shoulders. It presses into his family life as well. He and Nsiki are raising children in a house that feels one part home, one part surveillance zone. The kids learn early what it means when the car with the same license plate keeps passing. They learn the choreography of raids, the loud knock, the search, the questions, the moment when Papa goes away with the police, and no one knows for how long. In between, there are still jokes, stories, everyday arguments about schoolwork and chores. But watching his children sleep, Steve feels the urgency sharpen. He isn't just fighting for some abstract future South Africa. He is fighting a race against time for them to grow up in a world where their skin is not a sentence. How many more years will he have to push before the state pushes back in the only way it knows how, with deadly force? Outside his restricted circle, the country moves closer to eruption. In classrooms across townships, black schoolchildren are being forced to learn in Afrikaans, a language many of them associate only with police orders and government notices. The decision is bureaucratic in form, brutal in impact. It feels like yet another way to say, even in your thoughts, you will use our words. In student circles steeped in black consciousness, the response crystallizes. No underground discussions, some of them connected through people who have read or heard Biko's work, converge on a plan. On 16 June 1976, thousands of schoolchildren march through Soweto. They carry signs. They sing freedom songs. They are barely teenagers. Police respond not with negotiation, but with bullets. The Soweto uprising lives in the images that circle the world, as a single day, a single boy's body carried through the streets. But for Steve, under banning in King Williamstown, it lands as a shockwave that keeps echoing. News reaches him in fragments, whispers, banned photographs, relayed testimonies, while police cars idle outside. Children shot, hundreds dead or injured. Townships in revolt. The state blames agitators, Tsotsis, communists. But beneath the official language, Steve hears something else. They're blaming black consciousness without saying the words. His ideas, once dismissed by some rivals as student radicalism, have now helped give language and courage to school children facing live ammunition. For his competitor in the security branch, Soweto is a turning point too. The uprising proves that the regime's grip is not as secure as it believed. it also confirms their worst fear. This isn't just about labor strikes or bus boycotts. It's about a generation thinking differently, refusing the mental terms of their own oppression. Someone has to be made an example of, and the colonel already knows who the prime candidate is. Quietly, within the apparatus, the order hardens. Neutralize Biko. Not someday, soon. In the months after Soweto, Steve's banned world paradoxically becomes busier. Exiles slip back into the country to consult him. Young activists travel long distances just to talk for an hour, because those conversations have become, in their minds, a kind of advanced political training. Some of them arrive expecting a fiery ideologue and are disarmed instead by his humor, his patience, his insistence on thinking through the human cost of every tactic. He is not interested in martyrdom as a performance. He is interested in how people will live together after the system falls. But he senses, with increasing clarity, that he might not get to see that day himself. The state escalates the campaign of harassment. Steve is detained, released, detained again. Interrogations stretch into the night. Sleep deprivation, threats, the careful dance of intimidation. We know where your children are. We can make things very uncomfortable for your friends. Each time, he measures his answers, choosing his words carefully, aware that a single slip could be used to implicate others. Each time, he walks out again, bruised but unbroken, and the colonel feels the sting of a failed round in their ongoing duel. He thinks he's clever, the officer says to his team. He thinks he can outlast us, but deep down, each failure also proves something he doesn't want to admit. Fear hasn't hollowed this man out the way it was supposed to. Then, in August 1977, the clock and the rivalry converge in a single, fateful moment. On the 18th, Steve and fellow activist Peter Jones drive out of his banning area, heading toward Cape Town to meet other leaders and try to coordinate a fragmented movement. It's a risky move, but he feels the urgency. Time is running short, and the struggle cannot afford for its thinkers to be isolated from each other. On the road near Grahamstown, security police set up a routine roadblock that looks, in retrospect, anything but random. They stop the car, they check IDs, and then the colonel's men close in. In a few minutes of shouted orders and handcuffs, the most important black political thinker of his generation is arrested again. This time, under conditions that feel qualitatively different. They take him to the security branch offices in Port Elizabeth, to a building whose walls have heard far more screams than arguments. Officially, it's for questioning under the Terrorism Act. Unofficially, it's the long-awaited chance to break him, physically and mentally, before the banning order can expire, and his influence can mutate into something even harder to control. Windowless rooms, bright lights, a rotating team of interrogators. The colonel watches from the doorway, arms folded. A man who believes history has given him a simple task. Finally put an end to this troublemaker. What happens in that interrogation room over the next days will be dissected in inquests and books, but it will never fully be mapped. We know this. They beat him. They slam his head against a wall, hard enough to cause massive brain injuries. They leave him naked and shackled, humiliated, his body treated as if they can erase his ideas by degrading his flesh. At some point, he is lying on the floor, unable to stand, and still the fear that drives the men around him doesn't relent. Think about that. A handful of armed officers, backed by the full power of the state, terrified of a man who can barely lift his head. The official clock, the one on the banning order, still has months left. But inside Steve's skull, another unseen clock has started ticking loudly. A bleeding brain is a race against time that even the best hospitals sometimes lose. Here, in a police cell, where the men in charge don't want to admit what they've done, the race is cruelly one-sided. Instead of rushing him to a nearby hospital, they stall. They argue over paperwork. Then, in a decision that feels like a final act of contempt, they load his battered body into the back of a Land Rover and drive him, naked, on a 100-kilometer journey to a prison hospital in Pretoria. The message underneath the bureaucracy is clear. We will control even the manner of your dying. Imagine that journey from his perspective, if consciousness came and went. The rattle of the vehicle, the sting of cold air on exposed skin, the blur of passing landscapes he had spent his life trying to change. Towns, townships, fields, people who might have whispered his name, unaware that he is passing within meters of them, not as a leader on a speaking tour, but as a broken body in the back of a police van. The state believes this is the moment it finally wins the rivalry. The most dangerous mind in South Africa is contained, silenced, fading. On 12th September 1977, Steve Biko is pronounced dead in Pretoria. He is 30 years old. The official explanation, hunger strike, is an insult layered on top of lethal violence, an attempt to turn a political murder into a private act of self-neglect. But cracks appear in that story almost immediately. Photographs of his body, showing clear signs of severe injury, leak out. Doctors contradict each other. International outrage erupts. In death, the man they tried to hide becomes impossible to ignore. Newspapers around the world print his face. Diplomats ask uncomfortable questions. The apartheid regime, so careful in its choreography of control, looks suddenly clumsy, brutal, cornered. And here is the twist that no one in the security branch planned for. In finally defeating their rival, they turn him into something even harder to fight. A martyr whose writings now read not like abstract theory, but like prophecy paid for in blood. A symbol that crosses borders and languages. A shorthand for the price of dignity under a racist regime. The colonel can file his report, claim a grim sort of victory, but history tallies the score differently. The band man in a small town, the patient builder of clinics and consciousness, has lost his life. And yet, in the strange arithmetic of liberation struggles, the idea he lived for has just gained millions of new, furious adherents. Somewhere in the Eastern Cape, children he once greeted in clinic waiting rooms will grow up under his shadow. Their memories of Uncle Steve turning into something vast and historical. Somewhere in Soweto, a teenager who marched in 1976 will read his essays and realize that the words behind their chants had a face, a family, a terrible ending. The race the state thought it could win by stopping his heart now continues in a different arena. The battle over how his story will be told, who will claim his legacy, and whether the South Africa he imagined, whole, equal, unafraid of itself, can still be built without him. They tried to make his death look small, a line on a form, a lie about a hunger strike, a body moved at night so no one could see what was done to it. But when they put Steve Biko in the ground, the crowd that came to watch made one thing terrifyingly clear to the men in power. They had not buried a problem. They had buried a warning. And the whole world had come to hear what it was saying. In Ginsburg, in King Williamstown, news of his death doesn't arrive like a bulletin. It arrives like a scream. First in whispers, "They've killed Steve." Then in choked radio reports from abroad. Then in the unmistakable tremor of people dropping what they're doing and heading, almost on instinct, toward his family home. Women who saw him joking at the clinic. Old men who once doubted his student politics. Teenagers who only knew his name from whispered speeches and smuggled essays. They gather in clusters, asking the same question with a kind of dazed politeness, as if they can still negotiate with reality. Is it true? Inside the security branch, The colonel is playing a different game with the same terrible news. For him, the words, "Biko is dead," are not a shock. They are the result of a calculated escalation that went further than planned and now has to be managed. He walks into a meeting room where other officers sit with blue files and tight jaws. On the table lies the first draft of the official statement. Died after a hunger strike, it says. The colonel knows how weak it sounds. Even he doesn't believe it. But belief isn't the point. The point is time. If they can flood the world with this version fast enough, maybe, just maybe, they can outrun the photographs, the autopsy whispers, the bruises that tell a different story. That's the new race against the clock. Not Biko's 5-year banning order, not his lifetime of organizing, but a few crucial days in which the state's narrative has to harden before the truth leaks out. The colonel calls editors, ministers call ambassadors, police visit witnesses and remind them, with gentle or not so gentle pressure, that talking too much has consequences. Somewhere, a doctor hesitates over a medical report, choosing which words might let him sleep at night and which might end his career. Somewhere else, a photographer slides a roll of film into a pocket, already thinking about how to get it across a border. At the same time, Steve's family faces the most intimate and public negotiation of their lives: his funeral. The state wants it small, controlled, out of the headlines. His friends and comrades see it differently. They know that a funeral, under apartheid, can be more than a farewell. It can be a rally, a final act of defiance staged in the open, with hymns that sound suspiciously like protest songs and eulogies that slide from grief into accusation. In the end, the regime blinks. They allow a larger funeral than they wanted, perhaps still underestimating how many hearts Steve's message has reached. On that day in September 1977, the dusty roads leading to Ginsburg fill with people: priests in cassocks, students in blazers, women in headscarves, foreign journalists clutching notebooks and cameras. Soldiers watch from a distance, eyes behind dark glasses. Helicopters hover like angry dragonflies. But on the ground, in the speeches and songs, something is happening they cannot easily shoot or ban. People are saying his name out, loud in public, not as a terrorist, not as a troublemaker, but as what he has become, a martyr. Imagine the colonel seeing the aerial photographs later. Not a handful of mourners, but a mass of bodies, maybe 15,000 strong. Black clothes under the sun, hands raised. Somewhere in that crowd, posters and painted sheets carry words that cut through the official language. Biko lives. We shall continue the struggle. It must strike him like a bitter joke. He has done everything in his power to silence this man. And now, even the silence around the grave refuses to behave. It hums with a future he thought he could delay indefinitely. Outside South Africa, the clock is also ticking. But this time, it's counting down not to one man's death, but to the point at which the world can no longer pretend it doesn't know what is happening. Steve's case becomes the story diplomats bring up in wood-paneled rooms. At the United Nations, his name is spoken in debates about sanctions and arms embargoes. Newspapers that once reported on apartheid with cautious distance start using different words: torture, murder, police brutality. The regime hasn't just killed a man. It has given its critics a perfect, undeniable symbol of its cruelty. Inside the country, though, the men in charge double down. If they cannot erase Steve's death, they can at least try to erase the movement he helped shape. In October 1977, barely a month after his funeral, the government bans a wide swath of black consciousness organizations. Offices are raided, files are confiscated. Newspapers connected to the movement are shut down. Activists wake up to find themselves suddenly illegal, their meetings now crimes, their posters and T-shirts transformed overnight. From political statements into evidence. On paper, it looks like a decisive victory for Steve's old rival. The state's apparatus of control. Remove the structures, remove the threat. But the twist is already embedded in the nature of what Steve tried to build. Black consciousness was never just a set of offices or a newsletter. It was a way of thinking. A person who has read his essays and felt that internal shift from self-blame to self-respect doesn't unlearn it because a minister signs a banning order. The organizations are dismantled, but the language of dignity, psychological liberation, and self-reliance seeps into other spaces. Church groups, trade unions, youth organizations that arise in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Picture a student in the Eastern Cape a few years after Steve's death. He has never heard Biko speak, never seen him except in grainy photographs. But an older activist slips him a stapled booklet. I write what I like. It's an illegal copy, pages smudged, paragraphs underlined by 3 different hands. He reads it at night, under a blanket, the words lit by a flashlight that's also contraband after curfew. By the time he reaches the last page, something in him has stabilized. He feels less alone in his anger, more precise in his criticism, newly impatient with the subtler forms of inferiority he still finds in his own thoughts. That student will go on to join a union, or a community group, or a covert cell of organizers. When he speaks, he may never quote Steve directly, but the cadence of Black consciousness will be there, ghostwriting his courage. This is how the rivalry shifts after 1977. The Colonel isn't just trying to beat one man anymore. He's trying to beat a pattern of thinking that keeps popping up in new places. Wearing new organizational T-shirts, the battlefield moves from interrogation rooms to factory floors, from university campuses to church halls. The time pressure also flips. Once, Steve raced to turn ideas into institutions before the state could isolate him. Now the state races to smash each new wave of resistance before it matures into something they can't easily contain. The 1980s arrived like a long, tense drum roll. The economy stumbles. International pressure tightens. A new generation of activists emerges, weaving together threads of Black consciousness, African nationalism, and socialism. United Democratic Front, COSATU. Civic organizations that make entire townships ungovernable. Their leaders sometimes come from different ideological families than Steve did. Some were once his rivals in student politics, men who thought his emphasis on Black unity downplayed class or ignored white allies. But whether they admit it or not, they are organizing in a landscape he helped prepare. A South Africa in which Black people are less willing to see themselves as permanent juniors in someone else's revolution. In those years, the Colonel ages into a senior officer. He earns promotions, medals, the quiet respect given to men who do necessary work so others can enjoy the delusion of stability. But the work itself becomes harder. Each state of emergency feels more desperate than the last. The more they arrest, torture, and ban, the more resistant the country seems to become. For every activist broken in a cell, another takes their place, often younger, often already familiar with the routine. The knock, the questions, the attempt to make them hate themselves. It's as if the template Steve embodied, the man who refuses to internalize his oppressor's values, has become a recurring role in a play the police are trapped inside. Time starts turning on the regime. International banks hesitate. Athletes and musicians refuse to perform in South Africa. Cultural boycotts, economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, things once dismissed as symbolic, begin to bite. Somewhere in a prison cell, Nelson Mandela hears the news of Steve's death years after it happens and feels, behind the grief, the shifting calculus of struggle. The ANC in exile incorporates elements of Black consciousness into its own language, not necessarily in formal declarations, but in the way it talks about pride, culture, and the psychological scars of oppression. All the while, for ordinary people in South Africa's townships, Steve's name becomes both history and weapon. Murals appear, painted under cover of darkness, his face, stylized and stern, next to slogans about black pride. Police paint over them by day, teenagers repaint them at night, each fresh layer turning the wall into an archive of defiance. In funerals for other slain activists, priests mention him in their sermons as part of a wider cloud of witnesses. In secret seminars, young theologians revise their sermons with his ideas in mind, blending black consciousness with a radical Christianity that insists God is not neutral in the face of injustice. Then comes the twist no one on either side truly anticipated when Steve's body was loaded into that Land Rover. The regime begins to negotiate. Behind closed doors, in meetings that would have sounded like fantasy in the 1970s, senior officials sit across from men they once called terrorists. The colonel isn't at those high tables, but he feels their pressure in his own sphere. Suddenly there's talk of reform, of reducing tensions, of preparing for a new dispensation. Files that were once guarded with fanatical secrecy start to feel like liabilities. A question hovers in the corridors of power like a bad smell. What happens if we lose? Who gets sacrificed to save the rest? When apartheid finally begins to unravel in the early 1990s, it doesn't collapse in a single cinematic moment. It frays, then tears, with referendums and negotiations and marches and massacres. But from the perspective of legacy, one date stands out. 27 April 1994, the day of South Africa's first democratic election. Long queues overlap across the country, old women on sticks, young men in T-shirts, people who walked kilometers just to stand for hours and put an X on a piece of paper. Among them are men and women who once sat in Steve's meetings, who once heard him say that black people needed to free their own minds before any constitutional clause could mean anything. Some of them wear T-shirts with Mandela's face. Some belong to parties that didn't exist when Steve died. But if you could listen closely to their private thoughts as they approach the ballot box, you would hear his language echo. Dignity, humanity, equality, not as charity, but as birthright. By then, the colonel has retired or shifted sideways into some quieter role. He watches the election results on television, like everyone else. Mandela smiles that complicated smile of his. Part joy, part gravity, part survivor's grief. Commentators talk about reconciliation, about a new era. The colonel hears those words with mixed feelings. On one level, they sound like an escape hatch, a chance to slip away from the past under the generous umbrella of amnesty. On another, he feels something tighter in his chest because he knows reconciliation will require truth, and truth has a particular corpse in its basement. A man picked up at a roadblock in 1977. That is the next race against time. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. South Africa, instead of conducting thousands of individual trials, sets up a national stage where victims can tell their stories, and perpetrators can apply for amnesty on one condition. They have to confess fully. No more neat fictions about hunger strikes. No more vague references to fatal injuries sustained during detention. Names, methods, orders. The country's new moral logic is brutal in its own way. Freedom in exchange for the whole ugly truth. When the hearings reach cases like Steve's, the tension is almost unbearable. His family sits in the audience, older now, but still carrying the quiet focus of people who have lived for decades with a wound that never fully scabbed over. Activists who once debated him in university halls now sit beside them, their ideological differences dwarfed by the shared need to see his story told clearly. On the stand, Former officers shift in their seats, adjusting microphones with hands that have done far worse things. Imagine the colonel walking toward that witness table, years of service compressed into a few pages of prepared statement. He tells himself he is only following the rules of this new game. Say enough to get amnesty, not enough to incriminate people who still have power. But once the questions begin, control slips. Lawyers ask about dates, about who gave which orders, about who was in the room when the first blow landed. Commissioners, some of them former activists themselves, press harder when they hear evasions. You are asking us to believe that a healthy 30-year-old man simply collapsed during questioning. If there was no assault, how do you explain the head injuries? The colonel, who once defined success as breaking prisoners' stories, now finds his own story being broken open in front of a national audience. For viewers watching at home, the hearings feel like a ghost speaking through other men's mouths. Steve is not there, but his absence is the loudest presence in the room. His photograph appears on TV screens as reporters recap his life. Excerpts from his writings are read aloud in English, Xhosa, Zulu, Afrikaans, languages that once divided people, now braided together, to recount what was done to one citizen in the name of security. Young South Africans who were toddlers when apartheid legally ended hear his name for the first time, not as a distant historical abstraction, but as a person whose fate is part of the foundation they now stand on. And this is where his legacy takes on its most complex form. For some, Steve becomes a kind of moral compass, the radical conscience against which the new South Africa measures itself. Politicians quote him in speeches about nation-building, sometimes sincerely, sometimes with the convenient amnesia of people who forget how sharp his critiques really were. Academics write dissertations on black consciousness, tracing its influence on everything from education policy to cultural festivals. Artists paint his image on city walls, sometimes alongside other struggle icons, sometimes alone, his eyes staring out as if still, asking, "Are you living as fully free as you think you are?" For others, his legacy is more personal, almost domestic. A nurse who once volunteered at Zanampilo keeps a faded photograph of him in her living room, next to pictures of grandchildren and wedding days. When those grandchildren ask, "Who is that?" she tells them stories not just of slogans and politics, but of a man who remembered people's names, who cared whether the clinic had enough medicine, who believed dignity could be practiced in waiting rooms and staff meetings, not just shouted in marches. Yet legacy is never a simple statue you can dust once a year. It is a contested field. In the new South Africa, where enormous strides coexist with stubborn inequality, Steve's ideas can make people uncomfortable. His insistence on psychological liberation asks awkward questions about how much apartheid's logic still lingers in schools, in boardrooms, in the ways people see themselves in mirrors. His focus on black self-reliance challenges a generation tempted to outsource solutions to global markets, international donors, or distant technocrats. In university seminars, students argue not just over what he said, but over what he would say now about corruption, about economic policy, about who is really black in a country with 11 official languages and decades of mixed identities. That, in a way, is the final twist of his story. He is no longer a single rival in a duel with a single colonel. He has become a rival idea in every complacent conversation about race, power, and identity. When someone says, "We must be patient, change takes time," his ghost leans forward and asks, "Patient for whom?" When someone suggests that dignity can wait until after GDP growth, his old insistence surfaces that liberation without psychological freedom is just a reshuffled hierarchy. The clock, too, resets in each generation. For those who knew Steve, the urgency was to end apartheid before it ended them. For their children and grandchildren, the countdown is different, but no less real. How long before the memory of what people endured fades into polite myth? How long before the word apartheid becomes just a history exam answer rather than a warning about what happens when any society decides some people are less human? Walk today through Ginsburg, through King Williamstown, now part of a municipality renamed after him, and you can trace his presence in both obvious and subtle ways. Schools named in his honor, bursaries bearing his name, a grave visited by busloads of students and tourists, but also in quieter scenes. A community health project run by locals, a youth group discussing self-esteem and culture, a teacher telling students they should question textbooks, not just memorize them. Each of those moments is a small echo of a banned man who once sat in cramped offices and insisted that freedom had to start with how black people saw themselves. As for the colonel, history does not remember him with the same clarity. His name appears in commission reports, in footnotes of books, in the occasional news piece about former security policemen. One day, someone will read that name and not recognize it at all. The way a rusted key found in a drawer no longer matches any lock in the house, but when people say Biko, heads still turn. Conversations still pause. Arguments still ignite. In the end, the rivalry that defined the last years of Steve's life did not end in the interrogation room where one man stood and the other fell. It continues silently in us, between fear and dignity, between the convenience of forgetting and the work of remembering, between a world that offers oppressed people slightly softer chains and a world that invites them to break the idea of chains altogether. Steve Biko's life was heartbreakingly short. 30 years, a handful of essays, a few clinics, a banned voice that spent more time in small rooms than big halls. But the question he forced onto South Africa's timeline has outlived him by decades. Given the time you have, however little, what will you dare to change about how you see yourself and how you allow others to see you?